The Mars Volta is one of the most mind-boggling bands that I've ever listened to. The modern prog-rock band from El Paso, Texas, has its roots in previous bands like the short-lived dub band De Facto and the post-hardcore band At the Drive-In, with Cedric, Bixler, Zavala, and Omar Lopez being the key members that eventually shaped the Mars Volta. The band was formed in 2001 and has, over the span of a decade, released some of the most otherworldly and genre-bending albums there is to find. De-Loused in the Comatorium, their debut album from 2003, is their most commercially successful one, and it's also the one that fans look to as their most critical release. It also seems to be one of the more meaningful albums to the band because it was meant to preserve and honor the memory of their friend Julio Venegas, who sadly committed suicide at a very young age. But the album represents so much more than the homage to their friend. It's also a punctuation in the story of their previous band, At the Drive-In, an opportunity to shamelessly showcase their Latin American roots, and on a grander scale, a documentation of what musicians are capable of doing when pushing themselves to the edge. In this video, we'll take a deep dive into some of the history of the band. We'll also look at Roulette Dares, one of the more famous songs off of De-Loused, and we'll also talk about La Realidad de los Suenos, the newly released box set of theirs. So this is the history, sounds, and riffs of the Mars Volta. It's 2001. The post-hardcore band At the Drive-In had released their magnum opus, Relationship of Command, the previous year. An album that made all the bands and their fans turn their heads. But in February of 2001, guitarist Omar Lopez and vocalists Cedric, Bixler, Zavala decided to vote for a 6-month break to recuperate after an exhausting tour schedule. The band was supposed to start their US and world tour at this point, but Cedric and Omar felt completely drained from touring. On top of that, they were facing creative differences with the other members, particularly guitarist and co-vocalist
Jim who? Jim Ward. Ward. Oh, yeah.
Because of this, Cedric and Omar decided to set out on a small European tour with their side project, De Facto, instead. Shortly after announcing their wish to take a break, they received an email from their drive-in manager, Blaze James, explaining how they'd been outvoted, insisting that they come back to the US to continue the tour as At the Drive-In. But the guys had made up their minds. They were not coming back. Ideas of starting a new group started to flood into their minds, and this group would consist of Cedric and Omar, in addition to Jeremy Michael Ward. So he was the cousin of At the Drive-In vocalist and guitarist Jim Ward. He was a super talented sound manipulator, and apparently he was one of the most cherished friends that Cedric and Omar remembers from childhood. Jeremy was like the one cool white guy, the only one who wasn't judgmental to us, and never talked down to us. He was this burly white kid who skateboarded and was into different interesting kinds of music. So he never made fun of me for listening to salsa. He was inquisitive rather than dismissive, like most people were. Although De Facto was founded in '94, the same year as At the Drive-In, the group didn't get serious until '97. At this point, Jeremy had set up a furniture business in Tucson and offered Cedric a job. Omar would also drive out there, and together they recorded their first De Facto album. In retrospect, Omar remembers this time as a profoundly meaningful one. It was with De Facto that I kept my teeth, producing records, booking tours, and having responsibility. Soon, De Facto grew into something completely different from the dub band it was before. In addition to the previously mentioned members, we find keyboardist Ike Owens, Ike's friend, bassist Eva Gardner, and drummer Blake Fleming. Omar's goal was to create a group where their creative impulses wouldn't be stifled by the disinterest or limitations of other band members. They didn't want to face contempt for playing the music they liked in the tour bus, something they experienced in earlier years with At the Drive-In. We can finally just be ourselves. fucking paper everywhere. As this lineup, they recorded 2 songs with producer Alex Newport, Roulette Dares, and Cicatrice ESP, or Cicatrix, or Cicatri as it was called back then. And these are apparently available on YouTube, so I'll leave a link down below if you want to check those out. A little later, they got a new drummer, John Theodore, and together with him and Newport, they recorded 3 new songs that eventually turned into the Tremulant EP. And this was the first ever physical copy of anything that they had released under the name the Mars Volta. The guys were well on their way to chart out the direction for their new band. They would take inspiration from artists like Fela Kuti, King Crimson, Ismael Miranda, and Can, just to mention a few. Omar was also heavily inspired by films, Federico Fellini being one example of a director he's known for citing in interviews. But they didn't just take inspiration from their favorite musicians and filmmakers. It was just as important for Omar and Cedric to honor their Puerto Rican culture. Omar integrated bomba y plena into their music, a Puerto Rican dance and musical style originating from the island's history of African slavery. While growing up in El Paso, they felt the need to obscure and hide their Latin roots due to racism and bullying from their peers. This confrontation with racism kept on going even after they became a respected band with At the Drive-In. But now it was time for a change. Omar asked Cedric to cut down on the screams that he was known for from the drive-in years and encouraged him to sing instead. This time, both in English and Spanish. Another specific musical change was something they did to their drum set. They basically developed their drum set to become bigger so that they would have a more varied, deep, and heavy sound. And this is something that they had tried before with At the Drive-In, but they had kind of been ridiculed for doing that. I had a quick chat with my friend Paul Dumond, who basically helped me create the drum cover for Roulette Dares for this video. And he had some really interesting things to say about the drum setup.
I was aware that on this recording and throughout his time with the Mars Volta, John Theodore had like a cymbal stack that was just like 3 cymbals stacked up on top of each other. All of them were just broken to shreds. They're like bent and gnarled and like cracks all the way through them. And I always just would play along to these songs and use my hi-hat as that stack. But this time I kind of improvised my own stack and put an 18-inch crash cymbal on top of my 16-inch China, and it produced a very dark and chunky sound, and I think that it really helps the cover to actually have a cymbal stack similar to what John Theodore had.
By the way, a big shout out to Paul Dumond and Øyvind Lunde for helping me put together this cover of Roulette Dares. Paul Dumond has some amazing channels on Twitch and YouTube where he does drum covers, and Øyvind is the bassist of the Norwegian band Arata. To explain their sound, they basically sound like Royal Blood on steroids. Go and check them both out. There's links below. Furthermore, they wanted to show appreciation for the death of their friends. Cedric had played in a band called The Fall on Deaf Ears. 2 of his ex-band members, Laura Beard and Sarah Racer, were both killed in a car crash back in '97. Another one of their closest artist friends from El Paso, Julio Venegas, was a role model for both Cedric and Omar. He tragically committed suicide in '96. And so their first record would seal the memory of all these people.
Cry the dead artists out of the living past, 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 past.
This is De-Loused. And this album actually means a lot to me personally. I remember I was first introduced to it back in 2012. We're still in high school back then, I remember, and we were very lucky to be a part of this trip, language trip to Spain. During that trip, I remember my friend, Michael, he basically wanted to introduce me to these two amazing bands, according to him. And that was At the Drive-In and the Mars Volta. So when we were in Spain, we were going to take this bus trip from Malaga to a city called Granada. And when you're in Granada, you have this view over Sierra Nevada, which is this huge terrain of mountains and desert land, which is, yeah, it was just incredible to watch. So just being there, learning Spanish, visiting old medieval ruins, and listening to this, it was such a great combo. It was like an explosion of cultural input. And ever since that time, I've been a fan of De-Loused and the Mars Volta in general. Now, coming back to what Omar said in this interview, honor our roots, honor our dead, he basically had two objectives with this record. And I think you can both hear and see that in the whole concept of the album. Let's start off with the photograph or the cover. So it's basically a photograph of a golden egg, and there's a human face on that golden egg. It's kind of abstract, and the surroundings are a little bit more familiar though. There's a scalpel, there's a syringe, I think, and it's basically a hospital, but the focal point is this abstract being. In my opinion, maybe it symbolizes the things that are real and the things that aren't real, or perhaps the things that are real but we don't want them to be real because they're painful. It's kind of the merging of dreams and reality. La realidad de los sueños. Now, the band actually intended this to be the cover, and what I thought was really awesome about La Realidad de los Sueños, the box set, is that when it arrived, this was the front. This is how it was placed in the box set, how the band actually intended it to be. And so that was such a small detail, but something that I really appreciated and thought was cool. That's a little fun fact that I wanted to sprinkle into your mealtime video. So there you go. We now know that the band attempted to record the album twice, or at least they had an unfinished version of the album that the members thought would be the finished version. They rented Mad Dog Studio in Burbank, California during the summer of 2002 and started to work on this, De-Loused 1.0, or Landscape Tantrums as it's now officially called. This was released with the box set La Realidad de los Sueños through Clouds Hill on Friday, April 23rd, 2021. Later down the timeline, they got in touch with John Frusciante and Flea from Red Hot Chili Peppers, and they introduced them to Rick Rubin, one of the biggest names within the music production world across genres. And so these guys started to collaborate. Frusciante played on Cicatriz ESP, while Flea was involved on all the songs from the album except Televators and Ambulets. Rubin's role in all of this was obviously to produce the second version of this album. Now, it seems like he had a lot of influence over the album's overall sound, which I'm grateful for, because this sounds way, way better than this. I mean, this is interesting, and it's cool to listen to, but this is the cream of the crop, you know? Rick really oversimplified some of the parts that we thought were unique and just made them very digestible. He's got this thing about representing the common man's ears.
Rick Rubin really focuses on the vocal. You know, to him the vocal is the most important thing, like to most listeners, and the vocal is the band and is the music. So, you know, everything else, okay, throw it to the side, but the vocal and the enunciation and the quickness of it and the shortness of it, it's the most important part of the whole recipe or formula or whatever.
What's interesting about Landscape Tantrums is that the track listing is different compared to the finished De-Loused album. This one starts with Roulette Dares instead of Sonnet Lumière. Tírame a las aranas and Cicatriz ESP are two songs that are not included here. This is obviously one of the more exclusive things you find in the box set, but you also find a couple of, I guess they're demos. Enoch Provocateur, and this is I Pledge Upon Your Hissing Children. And we also find, ta-da, the Tremulant EP. This is awesome. I have been listening to this on YouTube for ages, and I thought, oh man, it would be so awesome to just have this as a physical copy. And of course you have all their other albums in here as well. Francis the Mute, Octahedron, Bedlam in Goliath, the best album, Nocturnicate, It Doesn't Suck. They're all there, all right? So I love this box set. Now, going back to De-Loused again, this album has, I mean, it's just packed. It's got bangers from start to finish. But I thought I would focus a little bit more on Roulette Dares, The Haunt Of, which is one of my personal favorite songs off of this album. Okay, so Roulette Dares, Omar Rodriguez Lopez is performing some of his guitar wizardry here. So we have some bends that sound very jarring, that the notes aren't really bent into the whole note at times, leaving you with kind of this microtone or out of tune note. In addition to that, you also have this C major 7. So that's that chord right there. It's a very positive and uplifting chord, but then you have the way that Omar is playing this is by basically just striking all the chords with full force, and it kind of reminds me a bit of what he did in At the Drive-In, where he would just from the verse, the guitar and the other instruments move over to this more calmer melody-oriented part. And that last part is probably not as soothing, and that's what Mars Volta love to play with. They have these huge contrasting parts of songs that stick up against each other. Then we move on to the chorus, which is completely different. It makes a huge statement. It basically starts with 2 Ds. And then you basically strum the G string on the 7th fret, and that turns that into a D. And then you strum the open D string, which, you know, is the D. Then it goes back and forth between D and C a couple of times. Then we go to an A minor. After that, I'm not completely sure about the names of the chords, but what is being played is something along the lines of this. And then it repeats like that. I could talk about so much more when it comes to the Mars Volta, but we'll have to wait with that for another video. In the meantime, I would just want to conclude by saying that the Mars Volta has an amazing and intriguing story that has a lot of ups and downs. They have a sound that's unlike anything else that I've ever heard. And if you're a guitarist or a bassist or just a musician in general and you want to learn their songs, boy, are you up for a challenge, because these songs are hard to learn. So yeah, on that note, thank you so much for watching.